So today's talk is all about the FLOODRE and the objectives and what it is designed to achieve. But equally important is what we need to do to make sure that we can manage and help FLOODRE get these benefits that they're trying to drive. It's my great pleasure actually to welcome FLOODRE's CEO, Brendan McCafferty here, who has, I think, had a pretty difficult task trying to get the market to bring this together and get the market to engage and deal with government. I have dealt with government in the past and I know how difficult that can be, so I think he's doing an absolute brilliant job. In addition, he has to bring forward the legislative and the public accountability frameworks. I know Brendan's been working extremely hard on that. Brendan's background, he's been in the insurance industry for a number of years. He's a qualified accountant and he's worked for Aviva and the RSA, and he's formerly UK President of the global insurance broker Willis. I'll say no more. I'll hand you over to Brendan McCafferty.
Peter, thank you very much. I take inspiration from the MGAA, actually, because I do remember Reg Brown coming to see me in my Willis days some time ago, several years ago, with the germ of an idea about creating an association for MGAs, and here you all are. So it can be done. This industry can still create great things out of nothing, and hopefully we're on our way to doing exactly that. There's a lot of ground to cover with FLOODRE. I know that FLOODRE has been on the radar screens for some reasonably considerable period of time, and probably feels like it's been a long time in gestation, which is just it's true really, it has. My purpose today is to bring you all up to speed with the progress that we've made with FLOODRE, and to make sure that everybody has got a very clear understanding about what FLOODRE is there to do, and probably as well what it's not there to do. And to bring you up to date with the journey that we've been on and our status in terms of transitioning to standing the organisation up and putting FLOODRE on its feet. And, of course, importantly, to work out with you what you need to do in order to take advantage of FLOODRE in combination with your insurers. So when you leave the room, you should have a very clear understanding of those three things. And if that's not coming across, stop me and tell me, and we'll try and do it a different way. The journey that FLOODRE has been on has been very challenging. There's no doubt about that. I guess the whole journey began in the early 2000s with the growing emergence of the problem of finding affordable flood insurance for customers as the industry got better at pricing flood risk which resulted from a better understanding of the peril more generally. But the advantage that I think FLOODRE has is that there are some very clear objectives for FLOODRE. Its success can be measured in the future by simply asking the question, have consumers been put in a better position so that flood insurance is both available and affordable? That's the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Now, available and affordable will obviously have to have some measurement put around them. But I think if you start from where you are today, it's not hard to find plenty of consumers, customers, that are able to show that they have experienced exactly the opposite. So as the insurance industry got better at rating the peril in to price, the consumer effect was that the price was going up. So there are examples out there of customers that used to pay £300–400 for their policy, and then suddenly overnight, after a flood event, they were being asked to pay several £1,000s. Or the deductible moves from £500 to £5,000 to £15,000 to £30,000. There are real examples out there of this. And of course that caught the political attention. And there was a need for a response from the industry, which went back to the early 2000s, and conversations and agreement with government about how that should be dealt with between the industry and government. The big stick, of course, that government had in the background was the threat to legislate this problem away, which is a very real one. And as we get into this, there'll no doubt be a conversation about the scope of FLOODRE and the equity of it and so on. But the reality is that in the Water Act 2014, the government took the power, it already exists in legislation, to compel the industry to write this business in proportions to be set by the Secretary of State. And in the absence of proportions being written by any individual insurer, the ability to levy a fine on that insurer of some considerable magnitude. So have that in mind, that that is the alternative when you look at FLOODRE as an option. Because there is something very counterintuitive about FLOODRE. It does distort the market. It is not a free market solution. But it is born out of that necessity that results from a better understanding of the risk and the pricing that commercially one would put against this, that increasingly was leaving that population of customers, probably 350 to 500,000 of them, that are increasingly unable to access affordable flood insurance. Clearly, we want in the industry to make sure that however that is done in a way that we create a level playing field for insurers, that we don't disadvantage insurers as far as possible, at least, in the marketplace following the creation of FLOODRE. And that's built into the way in which FLOODRE has been built in different ways, and I can comment on that. And, of course, to be consistent with the Memorandum of Understanding, which was the document that expressed the agreement between the industry and government that led to the creation of FLOODRE. And that included things like the fact that it would be capital neutral from the industry's perspective, and that there would be a degree of certainty over the capital position, and various other things. And so the concept of FLOODRE was born a number of years ago, and over the last 3 to 4 years has gone from concept into design. And now we're actually well into the build process of FLOODRE. So the way in which FLOODRE was designed made it such that it was always going to have a number of very unique characteristics and attributes. And it was necessary, clearly from the outset, to do that through a special purpose vehicle. And FLOODRE is exactly that. FLOODRE Limited is an organisation that has a whole raft of differences to a normal commercial insurer, not least its public accountability, which I'll come on to. However, it is a business that is being built in the same way that you would recognise an awful lot of startups. So it is going to be regulated by the PRA and the FCA in an identical fashion to any other venture. We do not get any special carve-outs in relation to the way in which we have to provide capital for the business and the way in which we'll be managed and regulated from the regulator's perspective. And I can tell you that we have been working very closely indeed with the regulator over several months now. I took up the job in September, and since then, barely a day goes by where I don't spend considerable time with the regulator. I'll be spending another 2 hours with them this afternoon. So that is no different. We enjoy the same scrutiny that you all do in running your businesses from the regulator. Importantly, FLOODRE is not seen as a solution to live in perpetuity. It has a lifespan set in the legislation of 25 years. And that's for a particular reason, which is that there is an acceptance that FLOODRE is not a market solution. And so it's a good thing to see that there is a way out for FLOODRE in the future. And from the industry's point of view, that was a vital ingredient, because without there being a method of getting off the drugs, if you like, of FLOODRE, then the industry would be stuck with FLOODRE forever, with the levy that goes with it, and there would be no incentive on government to deliver on its promise, which went with the Memorandum of Understanding, to maintain investment in flood defence, which is the way in which, of course, over time, this peril needs to be eliminated. And so, knowing that prices would return to market normal levels in due course provides that mechanism and that incentive. For FLOODRE and FLOODRE's board, it provides a different challenge altogether, which is to work out how to bring about that transition. So the day after FLOODRE is launched, in conceptual terms, there will be a suppressed price available in the market. And the idea is that after 25 years, provided the investment in flood defence happens from government, that FLOODRE will be no longer needed, but prices will remain where they were suppressed to, because the peril will have been eliminated. Of course, the opposite applies too, so that if government doesn't invest in flood defence, then, of course, prices will rise back to where they started from. Notice that FLOODRE is able to achieve either outcome. The reality is, though, that there is a political dimension to prices going back to where they were. The mechanics of FLOODRE are quite interesting and detailed, and we can't possibly cover all that detail today, but the essence of it is that FLOODRE is there to operationalise a cross-subsidy from about 98% of the marketplace that are not particularly prone to flood risk to about 2% of the market that is prone to flood risk. And it does that through effectively creating a pool that is accumulated over time by the collection of a levy on the industry to the tune of £180 million per annum. Now, the context for me of this is that that is a very big number indeed, where we are in a class of business, residential property, that made a profit roughly of about £500 million over the previous 3 years to 14, and the same, again, £500 million in the previous 10, because of weather, of course. £180 million a year is a very considerable sum indeed. So the first point to note is that nobody can really ignore it, it seems to me. There has to be some kind of economic response from the industry in order to be able to live with that degree of cost. We also have an ability to raise a second levy, which you could think of as the equivalent as being a rights issue, the ability to replenish the balance sheet should that ever be required. And what Levy 2 is a second levy on the industry that can be called by the directors for FLOODRE at their discretion in proportion to the requirements of the business from a prudential management perspective. And that's to an unlimited amount with an unlimited frequency. So it's a very considerable power for FLOODRE to have to raise that second tax. Hopefully, we'll never need to do so. And a lot of the financial engineering that we've been trying to put in place around FLOODRE is exactly aimed at reducing the prospect of that ever happening. So, along with the tax-raising powers, because that's what a levy is, we obviously have to have some degree of public accountability, which I'll come back to in a short while. But it remains for the insurers to decide what risks to cede to FLOODRE. That is a commercial decision for you to make. There is no compulsion involved in FLOODRE at all. So if you choose to cede nothing to FLOODRE and just carry the cost of the levy, that's up to you. We believe that FLOODRE represents a significant change to the market. Part of my provocation to you today is to ask what you think that change is. What's the strategic response? So insurers will make that decision and do so within the limits of the scope of FLOODRE. And of course, the insurer, or in your case the MGA, will continue to make the claim settlement with the customer directly. And the customer should notice no difference, apart from the fact that FLOODRE will be communicated to the customer at the point of sale or at some point in the early life cycle of the product, so that the customer has some awareness that they're benefiting from FLOODRE, and will give the consumer through you information about where to go for information about resilience, that is, defending their property from flood in the future, and where to go to understand the degree of exposure they have at an individual property level to the flood risk. So the customer experience is pretty unaffected, and importantly, I'd say as a round up to all of that, insurers continue to set prices, not FLOODRE. There is no capping of prices that automatically goes on because of the existence of FLOODRE. It is for you to decide what pricing you want to put in front of the customer. What we have is a clear tariff of inwards reinsurance premiums set by council tax band that creates the certainty for you about what the economic cost is of ceding business into FLOODRE. We also have a liability limit, and you may have noticed we've commented in the press in the last few days about launching our reinsurance programme, and we are going out to buy £2.1 billion worth of cover. And that tells you something about where the liability limit is likely to be for FLOODRE. Now that, if you were to look at the vendor models and the catastrophe modelling outputs, is a considerable number, and is deliberately so a number that should inspire confidence amongst the industry that FLOODRE is never going to be caught out by an event exceeding, say, 1 in 200 that might put us in a position of not being able to pay claims. So we have purposefully set out to have a very conservative view of that liability limit. But the liability limit has the certainty of statute. Nobody should be in any doubt about the extent of our liability at the outset. And of course, the whole premise is that through market forces, through the existence of a subsidised inwards reinsurance tariff, that we should create demand because pricing should reflect the existence of flood re in the street price to the customer. And the customer demand will be generated from that and volume will happen. Now, I think as well as that economic reality, which is arguable, I suppose, there is the factor of insurer behaviour and consumer behaviour, which adds to the uncertainty of what we can expect to see being seeded into flood re. I think it's also important to remember from our point of view that if you look at the 2007 weather event, which was nearly £1 billion worth of claim cost, the reality is that something like 70% of the properties that were inundated didn't appear on a hazard map. So it's a reminder that this is a fundamentally uncertain peril. And so there is that need for flood re to exist in order to try and combat the effects of that, but also to work with the vendor modelers and others to develop our insight as an industry into that peril. Flood re is, by all accounts, an incredibly unique organisation. We result from this conversation that took place between the industry and government. Flood re as a concept was taken to government by the ABI as a solution to a very long-running problem. And the Memorandum of Understanding set out how it should work. The result is that flood re will be and is owned and operated by the insurance industry. Our shareholders are those businesses that write UK household insurance, provided they elect themselves to membership, they apply for membership. And you, through that mechanism, have exactly the same rights as any shareholder would have under company law in a traditional limited company or PLC. And you would all recognise the executive structure within flood re. We have chief actuary, CFO, an operations director, and so on. And we have a board of directors made up following normal FRC practice, good practice, including a chairman, Mark Oban, who was until recently a government minister, having stepped down from Parliament at the last election. That then sits alongside the public accountability. It's quite right that because we have these pretty awesome tax-raising powers, we have to have the matching accountability. And so flood re is publicly accountable. But when you look at the traditional way in which organisations are held to account in the public domain, that's usually through a ministry or a department. With flood re, it's rather different. We do not have a line of account through DEFRA or the Treasury or anywhere else. Instead, we have accountability directly to Parliament. And there is something called the responsible officer, which happens to be the CEO, that has a personal accountability to Parliament on behalf of flood re. So this makes it quite different. And it ensures that flood re has in mind all the time as it goes about its business, achieving not just economic outcomes for the industry, but also public purpose outcomes as described in the legislation, which is centred around making flood insurance available and affordable to consumers. As a reminder of the scope, because for a long time it was unclear what flood re would cover and not cover, and has been quite contentious. And this is probably our simplest way of trying to communicate that. In the round, flood re is for homeowners. It's for residential property owners that are not leasehold. Okay? So it's a property that needs to be insured in the name of individuals. It needs to have a council tax band. It needs to have an individual premium and be occupied by the person making the application for the policy. Also, then, there are a couple of notable exclusions. Homes built after 2008 are excluded, and that was because at the time the deal was done with government, there was a strong desire on the industry not to make the moral hazard worse of encouraging or creating an atmosphere of nobody should care about properties being developed on floodplain. So that was built into the agreement. Small businesses, SMEs and leasehold properties have of course caused controversy, However, that is behind us. That is a decision that we have now moved beyond. The regulations for the secondary legislation, that is, for FLOODRE, was laid in Parliament again a couple of weeks ago and is beginning its passage through Parliament now. And the scope of FLOODRE is therefore set, because Parliament cannot and will not change that scope. Only the Secretary of State could do that in the form of the legislation that she puts into Parliament. So that's how FLOODRE was built. That's the objective of FLOODRE and some of the scene setting about what makes FLOODRE different. Where are we now and what can you expect? Well, the journey that we've been on has been very considerable and complex. If I try and take the main elements and dimensions of getting FLOODRE off the ground, firstly, of course, there is the legislative backdrop, which caused considerable difficulty this time last year. This time last year, the ABI was describing FLOODRE as unworkable, and rightly so. And so we needed to go through very prolonged and rather agonising negotiations with government at the back end of last year, which proved successful, and we came out with a deal we could agree. And that's been followed by nudging government to get the legislation back into Parliament, the secondary legislation, which happened a couple of weeks ago, which is the final part that will be played in parliamentary process terms. We've had the state aid approval from the EU, and we've now, importantly, made our application to the regulators for the approval of FLOODRE, which is a very considerable task indeed, over 2,000 pages of documentation, which resulted from months of hard graft and effort from a very dedicated team to who I will always be grateful. And we now await the response of the regulator and no doubt will engage with them over the coming weeks. But a very important milestone for us. I've already mentioned that we began our procurement for our £2.1 billion reinsurance programme, obviously a very significant entree into the market. Good news for the reinsurance market because it will look for them, at least for the time being, like new money, which is good news for them. And that's on the back of Guy Carpenter being appointed earlier in the year, and also the appointment of Capita, who are our third-party administrator, and they're busy with us building our systems and infrastructure now to run FLOODRE. And you know, the considerable effort that's needed to get an enterprise like FLOODRE off the ground should not be underestimated. It's a complex undertaking, as I'm sure you will appreciate. And also we're reaching out to the industry and working very hard to engage those parts of the industry that can help insurers and us, such as Polaris, to work out how to engage optimally with software houses. And that process is getting some momentum right now. And of course, as I've said, we've appointed our key members of the executive team and our board, and that's a process that continues. And we're beginning to populate the next layer down in our organisation. It's worth saying that, you know, don't expect FLOODRE to be 200 people. It never will be. It's probably going to be 20 to 25 people. But of course, we will have a very big, a considerable virtual team across Guy Carpenter and across Capita. But all the decision making, the policy, the accountability, the engagement with the industry will live within my team in FLOODRE. Some of the important topics that you know, we've had to get across in recent weeks, a little more granular. We have issued now draft reinsurance treaty and underwriting manual, having completed months of preparatory work about that, to some of the larger insurers for their final review. And you may well have already seen that we released technical specifications to industry back in the early part of the year, January, February time. In fact, we ran a whole load of breakfast briefings to make sure that that was communicated well. And within FLOODRE, we've taken all the big decisions about our business plan, obviously necessarily for the PRA application, and have, in my view, a very robust and resilient business plan that is engineered to be able to pay claims from day one and deal with the crisis from day one, and also to grow and become a fully fledged reinsurer over time and have the option of retaining more of its risk. We've relied on various partners to help us through that journey. We have had a virtual team sat alongside me of well over 100 people for a large part of this year in order to get that done, including professional advisors from various firms. We have now got to a point where there is a strong communications plan in place. You will be hearing more from us. That definitely does, of course, have an industry-facing component to it, but increasingly we are taking steps to improve the awareness amongst consumers and media that FLOODRE is coming. We do that appropriately. We do not look to take the place of the industry in communicating around FLOODRE, but simply to make sure that the messaging and clarity is out there. And there is a growing demand for that amongst stakeholders. Importantly, we are on track to communicate in July, late July, what the steps will be to onboard to FLOODRE. What do we mean? That is how you get yourselves as a business onto the bus of being able to launch with FLOODRE next April. So the mechanisms are about to be released to explain to you how that is going to happen. And that builds upon the workshops and the breakfast briefings that we held earlier in the year. And we saw a tremendous response from the industry during that process, and saw 350 to 400 delegates pass through the door for various workshops. So if you look at floodre.co.uk, you will find all of that material there, and that gives you all the detail that you need to be able to initiate your IT projects, to build the business processes and systems to link in and be able to seed business to FLOODRE. We continue, we will always be, to some degree, in the political eye, and so we will continue to make sure that there is a political narrative and a political engagement that's ongoing from FLOODRE, not least to make sure that the industry gets the credit for doing this, for making sure that there is a solution to a very important economic problem for a growing number of people. We are now at a phase within the project, I still call it that, it's increasingly feeling and looking like a business, where we have now got to the point of being about 4 weeks away from completing the internal system build within FLOODRE. And that's all the components that will allow the seeded business to happen, for claims to be paid, for the information that's needed to be able to look up the tariff of inwards reinsurance premium that you will need to have, which I'll remind you is based on council tax band. The year of build, all of that information will be made available. That build is a short number of weeks away. We will then we'll go through a period of testing those systems internally, to making sure that they talk to one another, and that we are then in a position as a fully fledged business with the infrastructure in place to commence testing with the industry, which will happen probably towards the end of September. That's when we will open the doors to start industry testing. And the process that will follow is to invite you through the onboarding process to apply for a test slot in due course, which you should expect to take somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks duration to do a test. And we will keep that testing running all the way through between September and next April, when we plan to launch. And of course it will continue beyond that, because not everybody by any stretch of the imagination is going to be ready by next April. I understand you're all going to have your own IT stacks and your own workloads and demands. So the doors will remain open indefinitely. We are doing as many events like this as we can. We are very keen to provide any assistance that you can benefit from our giving, to make sure that you have the clarity you need. In terms of principle, I think it's important that FLOODRE and my team, as far as possible, put you in a position, if you want to go for April, of being able to do so. That is our intention. There are a whole range of other things that need to happen before FLOODRE can launch, of course. We are subject to regulatory approval. We have to have the systems testing completed satisfactorily. We have got to get the regulations through Parliament. Now, we have a commitment from the Secretary of State that that will be done by the end of October, which fits with our timelines. And, of course, we have to have the reinsurance programme in place, and all of the MI reporting and all of the systems testing done and finished. So there's still a considerable amount of work to do. This is not a done deal yet, in the sense that there's still work to do. But it is coming. FLOODRE is not going to go away now. It's happening. The £180 million levy starts in April. And I think that's what you have to have in mind. And you have to figure out what your strategic response is to that. We are continuing to engage partners, and there's a rather messy picture of what that looks like to us, which is needing to take account of not just the existence of carriers, but also the distribution routes that they take, which of course include MGAs. And working out what messaging alignment needs to occur between the participants, the insurers, ourselves, the ABI, government and so on. There is a plan that exists that kind of brings this to life that I won't bore you with, but just takes some reassurance that we are doing that. And you will find ways of getting the information that you need in order to respond to FLOODRE being made available. We'll continue to run our breakfast briefings. We'll have another raft of those later in the year. And we will continue, for example, to turn up at BIBA and take part in those events that are appropriate that allow us to get our message out. We also plan to have a number of webinars on the back of the onboarding process, so there will be help at hand and people available to assist you with that. And we will continue to increase the awareness of FLOODRE amongst consumers appropriately. And have organised an approach to software houses to make sure that we are engaging helpfully, I hope, with the software houses to give them the clarity that they need in order to get the bridge building done into FLOODRE. And our brand comes to life in the background. There is a website, floodre.co.uk, and a host of material that's now available in order to give life to that. And my team are there to respond to you in any way that we can. It is in our interest, because it's part of our objective, to promote the interests of FLOODRE so that advantage can be taken from it. So I return to my favourite topic, which is, what are you going to do to get the value out of the £180 million levy that's on its way? For me, that whole topic sparks a number of questions. Firstly, what does that mean for your new business? Does that alter your proposition? Does altering your proposition have a strategic implication? Are there adjustments that you need to make to your economic model, to your customer proposition and your marketing in order to reflect the fact that FLOODRE is going to be a reality? And whilst you might expect a gentle take-up of FLOODRE, we all know what the pace of life is like, and I'm sure that in a few months' time after launch it will feel like FLOODRE has been around a long time, and I'm pretty sure that because of the £180 million levy it will be making its presence felt. So, if that conversation is not happening in your businesses, I would encourage you to start to have the conversation. And if you want us to come along and work with you on that to kind of figure it out in the sense that give you the information that you may need to do so, we'd be very happy to do so. On the back book, of course, the question is, what cases are you going to seed or not seed and retain? I'm fully aware of the pressures there. A lot depends on the weather and whether one has good expectations of the weather over the next few months or not. Who knows? And whether you want to maintain your top line or you're prepared to lay off the risk and take away the peril that you've got to the exposure rather that you've got to flood. Now, many insurers are feeling reasonably aware of what peril exposure they have. Others are not so sure. It often reflects investment in previous years in understanding flood and whether or not there's a degree of modelling going on there or whether solutions are brought in from vendors. I hope that one of the effects of FLOODRE is actually to encourage insurers to continue with that investment, because without doing so, others will, and surely the consequence would be that volume would be lost to you if you're not keeping pace with that. From my point of view, of course, I would like to see the right cases being ceded to FLOODRE, whatever that number is, and for the consumer to benefit. That is FLOODRE's purpose. Right now, FLOODRE is being built and paid for by the members of the ABI. That is a very considerable investment, in excess of £20 million by the time we launch. And they've made that investment because of the reasons I've set out earlier in the presentation. So this is a very big deal on a number of levels. For distribution, which to a degree, if you like, depending on your interpretation, might include MGA. I would encourage you to have the conversations with your insurers, your capacity providers now, as to who and how you're going to respond to FLOODRE. So the economic arguments that I've already set out are added to by the complexity of needing to figure out the degree to which an MGA would want to cede business on behalf of the insurer and pay claims on behalf of the insurer. Now, at the outset of FLOODRE, at this point in time, our intention is that MGAs and let's call them partnerships with insurers that have fully delegated authorities can apply with the insurer sponsorship to submit cases and to seek claims payments directly from FLOODRE. I'm sure that that will evolve over time, but that's where we start from. There will be other considerations too, things like quota share arrangements and part payments that will come through later. We need to start somewhere. We believe we have a workable operating model, the details of which are in those packs that I've referred to. But for now, I think that the conversation between MGAs and insurers is an important one to figure out what is the response to FLOODRE and how to operationalise that and where to operationalise that, and whether or not the insurer wants to retain the ability to make the ceding decision or not. So when we release our onboarding pack, it'll be a pack of about 8 documents, a fairly hefty tone, some of which you'll want to pass straight to your lawyers and other aspects of which will interest you from a commercial perspective. It includes, for example, the registration form, which is tell us who you are and tell us that you want to join in. Something called a data sharing agreement. So necessarily, because of how FLOODRE works, there's a need for us to have agreements in place with 16 separate public bodies that provide data around council tax band and year of build. Now, we hold that contract with those 16, but we will also want a contract to be in place between ourselves and the insurers who need that data to make this work, in order to protect that data and be able to demonstrate that that's what we will do. And that will be captured in these data sharing agreements. We'll have a test readiness checklist, obviously, to make sure that we're not going to be wasting one another's time when we commence testing, and a couple of other legal documents as well, and access to the test site. So you can see that there's a fair degree of detail that's going to be made available quite quickly. And as you go through those test processes, we'll be booking slots where the readiness will be taken into account, and we'll flex the scale of our response to that appropriately so that we're not creating disadvantage for those that want to test it in a particular time frame. And we will be providing clear checklists of when we think the test has been passed or otherwise, and setting out our expectations of what needs to be in place for an insurer or MGA or participant to be part of that launch in April, and to be clear about any missing ingredients or components that need to be thought about and put right. So that's what's coming next. But the point is, FLOODRE is happening. FLOODRE is coming. There is a strategic response needed from insurers and MGAs and distributors alike. And it's not that far away. We have August coming up, and most people will be heading off into the sunshine, I'm sure. When you come back from that, the testing will be starting in September, late September. So it's something that you need to pay attention to now. I'd encourage that, please. And please reach out to us if there are questions. And I think that's probably plenty from me for now.
Brendan, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I said at the beginning that he's done a brilliant job. I mean, to work with 16 bodies and get them to agree, and with government as well, I think is a phenomenal achievement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your function. Please, any questions from the floor? And if you could wait for the mic. I've got one, if I
ask a question?
Please, Mike, thanks.
I was just interested about the choice of excluding leaseholders. Obviously, appreciate that often that's owned by a company, but in a lot of cases people have contents and buildings that are affected by flood. What was they thinking around?
Well, the first thing is there's nothing stopping a leaseholder buying contents insurance and having that ceded to FLOODRE. That can happen. So we're talking about buildings. Now, clearly, you know, in a scheme like this, where there is a decision taken that it's not for business, then there has to be some demarcation somewhere. There has to be a boundary, and that's where the boundary was chosen. That, you know, the reality is, and I've experienced it myself, I've run both carrier businesses and distribution businesses with exposure to leasehold properties, that there is a functioning market out there for that type of business. Now, that has, of course, been a point of contention. But I think the challenge remains for those that hold that view to present the evidence that that's the case. When you've done that, it won't be me solving the problem, because FLOODRE's scope is set now. It's set in statute. So the solution would have to come from somewhere else if it were decided that such a solution were needed. But that's all it is. It's a function of the pragmatism that's needed to draw that boundary somewhere, and the view that 4 or more properties would probably qualify as a business rather than a set of domestic properties.
Thank you, Brendan. We actually have a question from one of our board members, Jeff Turner of Miramar, who was saying the sheer amount of information required by FLOODRE is quite untenable, and the majority of MGAs that work on a risk bordereau basis. Are you confident that the information that you will require is easily accessible for the MGA?
I think it will vary. I think the reality is that we have tried really hard to be pretty flexible in what we're saying are mandatory fields to be completed in the bordereau. Now, of course, we are risk carrying. We have to be able to do 2 things. Firstly, understand our exposure. If we can't satisfy the regulator that we're putting in place mechanisms to understand our exposure, we'll never get authorised. It's a necessary thing to do, as you know, when you're looking to carry risk. So that drives the necessity of it in the first place. When we sat back and looked at what we were asking for, we could probably see the point, actually, that there was a great deal of granularity being asked for. And so what we've said with a lot of the fields is that where the information is available, we would want to have it. But we have narrowed the focus of those fields that we consider mandatory to be a lesser amount, a smaller subset of the total. And we just hope that insurers will work with us, understanding our problem, if you like, and where they can, they will make the effort to provide that data to us. It will be vitally important, as FLOODRE needs to track its actual exposure, firstly against the business plan, and secondly, over time, to be able to make the right decisions in the future regarding the shadow pricing that we will need to do. Why will we need to do that? Because FLOODRE will be reviewed in due course. The statute relating to FLOODRE will be reviewed at least every 5 years, and sooner if we felt it necessary. And that will require us to be able to provide insight into the moving parts so that policymakers can agree with us what the action is that's needed, which might include things like changing the tariff of inwards reinsurance premium to incentivise or disincentivise volume. So it's a necessary evil, I'm afraid.
Thank you for that. Any more questions from the floor? I've got one that I picked up, if I may. You talk that you mentioned during your talk about your engagement with the regulator, and we know that in June they issued their recent thematic review on the delegated authority arena. Are you comfortable with the fact that where an MGA designs the product, then the set of words that we will incorporate within that product will satisfy the regulator?
Yes, I mean, I think, frankly, FLOODRE would be pretty agnostic about that. From our point of view, we rely upon the wording that insurers have generated, and we'll follow the fortunes. So we have no, particular bent on that, and we rely upon that principle. From the point of view of what would happen if there was an issue, well, we have in the treaty our own definitions of things like flood, as you'd expect us to have. So we have a backstop against which we would rely legally. And that is pretty watertight. That has gone through a very elaborate process of review, all sorts of legal opinion obtained, and importantly, all sorts of industry perspectives taken on it too. So, I think we're in a position of believing that we can cope with whatever the industry brings to us from whatever source.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, I'll bring this session to a close. Would you please join me in thanking Brendan for an excellent presentation?
Thank you.